Hey guys, I got little Kelly right here. We're going to do some review before we finish up chapter 17. So, before we move on to 17 lesson 4, let's talk about what happened in lesson 1, 2, and 3. Abe Lincoln is the president at the end of the Civil War. He wants to take the two pieces of the country, put them back together, but unfortunately he's assassinated and cannot complete his task. So, when he's assassinated, Andrew Johnson becomes the next president. And Andrew Johnson struggles to get anything done. Anytime Congress passes a law, he vetoes it. They override his veto, and after a while, they decide to impeach Andrew Johnson. So they vote to remove him from office, and they're one vote short from removing Andrew Johnson. So after the war is over, the South is in bad shape. They need to have the roads rebuilt, they need to have the bridges repaired, and some people come to the South making promises to fix things. Those people are going to be the scalawags and the carpetbaggers. And most of them are making empty promises or using and manipulating people. And the last thing before we go on, after the war was over, the African American people were no longer slaves, but they had to find work. And unfortunately, they were taken advantage of. They would go to the farms and they would work in two ways, sharecropping and tenant farming. And no matter how hard they worked, their debt would increase and they would owe more and more money. Eventually, it was no better than slavery. In February of 1870, the 15th Amendment was passed and it gave African American men the right to vote. So, what this means for America is right now, all men are allowed to vote, regardless of their race or anything. If they were slaves before, they were now allowed to vote in presidential elections. So, women still do not have the right to vote. So women do not have suffrage, and suffrage is another word for the ability to vote. A lot of people in the South did not like this. They did not want the African Americans to vote because they were afraid that they would be able to decide the outcome of an election, and they thought they would get people in that were going to work to give them more freedoms and more protections. So a lot of the racism that was present in the South during the Civil War is still present. So some southern states tried to figure out ways to prevent African Americans from voting. They started giving reading tests to African Americans, and if they could not pass the test, they were told they couldn't vote because they didn't understand the Constitution. They also found a very grimy way to keep people from voting. They passed a law called the Grandfather Clause. And the Grandfather Clause said that if your grandfather could not vote, you cannot vote. So what that meant is all of the former slaves, their grandparents couldn't vote. So that means that they can't vote. And when they have children, their children's grandparents wouldn't have been able to vote. So they won't be able to vote. So no matter what, they would never be allowed to vote. So the South was determined to stop African Americans from voting. And they couldn't say they can't vote because they're African American, because the 15th Amendment gave them that right. So they figured out another way to prevent them. So within about 30 years of the Civil War being over, they had lost most of the freedom they'd fought for. So there was lots of other problems for the African Americans after the Civil War was over. In the South, a group was started called the Ku Klux Klan, or the KKK. They wanted to prevent African Americans from voting. They wanted to punish the scalawags and get the Northerners, or the carpetbaggers, to leave the South. And they used violence to intimidate their victims. And lots of times, the violence would lead to murder. And the most frequent victim of their hate and attacks were going to be African Americans. So,
We go back to President Grant. President Grant was a war hero. He was very popular. He helped fight to free the slaves, but he didn't have very much experience in politics. He found out that being the president was a lot different than being a general, and he chose his friends and people who he trusted to be in his cabinet and help him run the country. It's pretty similar to Andrew Jackson using the spoil system to give jobs to supporters. Grant is choosing people who he thought he could trust to do a good job. And Ulysses Grant was a pretty good guy. He was trustworthy. He had good intentions, but a lot of his friends that he picked were not honest people. And if you're a good person and you hang around with a bunch of people that aren't, your reputation is going to be damaged. And that's what happens to Ulysses Grant. A lot of his time as presidency gets ruined because his friends and his employees are involved in scandals. And a scandal is when they are doing things they should not do or acting inappropriately. They were trying to use their government jobs to get rich. Despite all this, Grant is elected for a second term. So after he becomes president for a second term, the country goes into a depression. If you guys remember what a depression is, it's not talking about people's emotional states. It's talking about the amount of money they have coming in. Businesses and factories began to shut down. It's actually one of the things people are worried about right now. With all of these businesses closing and temporarily shutting down, it could cause a chain reaction. People losing their jobs, and then they're no longer able to spend money. The country could go into a depression as well. Thousands of workers lost their jobs. People had no money to buy food. And when people don't have money to buy food and take care of their families, that's when things get desperate. People resort to crime, they resort to stealing to take care of their families. So during this time, people blame Ulysses Grant for it. He's the president. They say it's his fault. So the elections happen, and the Republicans lose a lot of seats and support in Congress. So now Ulysses Grant has to work with a Congress that's not all his team anymore, and it's much harder for him to get things accomplished. And he's going to catch all the blame. So, if you guys remember earlier talking about the Reconstruction Plan, that was the plan to rebuild the South after the war. And people in the North were getting tired of this plan because they were paying to fix a lot of the damage in the South. They did not want to keep paying these extra taxes for this war because it's been over for 10 years. A lot of these people no longer cared about the South struggling, and they were ready to move on. So the next election is coming up, the election in 1876, and people are looking for a president who will restore faith and trust in the government. So they're looking for someone who they can trust, who they believe is going to have their best interest in mind. Okay, so in this election, the Republicans choose Rutherford Hayes, the governor of Ohio, to be their candidate to run for president. He's got a reputation of being an honest man, which is what a lot of people are looking for. The Democrats chose a guy named Samuel Tilden, the governor of New York. So Tilden wins the popular votes, which means more people voted for him, but neither candidate won a majority of the electoral votes. That means, remember how we talked about each state is worth a certain amount of points? Neither one of them got enough points to actually win the election. If you guys remember, when there's a tie or there's not enough votes for one person to win, the House of Representatives has to decide the result of the election. So Rutherford Hayes makes a deal. He promises the South that he would end Reconstruction and basically get out of their business if they chose him to be the president. And a lot of people in the South were tired of the North being in their business. So this was called the Compromise of 1877, and the people in the South liked the idea. The representatives talked it over, and they decided that they supported Rutherford Hayes, and Rutherford Hayes becomes the president. He kept his promise, and within a couple months, he pulled all of the troops out of the South. So after this, the country celebrates its centennial. And a centennial is a word for 100-year anniversary. The United States had become 100 years old at this point, and a lot of things had changed. So, in the period following the Civil War, things got better for a while, and then it's going to go back the way it came, where racism and discrimination is going to start to become more prevalent in the South. So there's lots of problems still. Freedmen or former slaves fight for the rights that they thought they had earned, the rights that they did earn by fighting in the Civil War. So they fought and they were able to get two African American senators elected between 1865 and 1877. Both of them were from Mississippi and they proved to be good, honest politicians. After Reconstruction, the southern state governments began denying African Americans social equality and the right to vote. So once they took the North and the troops out of the South went back to its old ways and they stopped letting African Americans vote and stopped letting them have the equal treatment that they deserved. In some states, they're no better off than they were before the Civil War. Okay, guys, let's take a look at the worksheet for Chapter 17, Lesson 4. It says the end of Reconstruction. I'll give you a couple of answers. So the 15th Amendment guaranteed blank to all male citizens. One of these words up here means the right to vote. The answer to the first one is suffrage. I know that sounds like a bad thing or like you are in pain, but suffrage means the right to vote. Let's go to number 8. President Grant's administration was harmed by many. So this is when his friends were involved in things they should not have been, when they were doing inappropriate things. The word for that is scandals. Let's look down at number 14. Southern state governments denied African Americans social blank. This word means when everyone should be treated fairly. They denied African Americans social equality. Okay, you guys should be able to fill in the rest of those. Let's take a look at the side that says Reconstruction ends, and I'll help you out with 2 or 3 of these ones as well. So, question number 1. Some states passed a grandfather blank to stop African Americans from voting. The word that goes there is clause. And clause means a section of a document. Let's go to number 4. Many Southerners, including the KKK, did not want African Americans to what? They did not want them to participate in the government. They didn't want them to have a say. Another word for having a say in the government is vote. We'll do one more. Number 7. The country suffered a blank during President Grant's second term. That's when people do not have enough money. They don't have jobs. The word for that is a depression. Okay, so use what we highlighted, use the clues, and fill out the rest of this worksheet.